All right, our first speaker is Natalie Lounsbury. She is a faculty research assistant at the University of Maryland's Department of Environmental Science and Technology, and she works with Dr. Ray Weil. Today she will be presenting her presentation entitled Winterkilled, Cover Crops. Welcome, Natalie. I'm turning the screen over to you.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. These webinars are a little weird, I think, and so it's weird for me not to be able to see you. But if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. I may see it and answer you. I may see it and ignore you. But anyway, just enter it, and if we can get some interaction going, that'd be good. So I can tell if people are following me or not. So. Today I'm going to talk about winter-killed cover crops, and it's sort of a bit of a thought piece. I don't have necessarily as clear conclusions as people might want, but we'll see how it goes. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about what farmers want and what farmers fear from cover crops first. Then winter-killed cover crops, especially forage radish, and nutrient cycling. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the project that I worked on for my master's, which is no-till vegetable production after forage radish. And then there should be time for questions at the end, but like I said, if you've got questions as we go along, feel free to type them into the chat box. All right, so I have kind of an obsession with these old documents because I think they're a good reminder of where we've been, what we already know, and where we're going. So this publication is a USDA publication from 1936, Cover Crops for Soil Conservation. So, okay, someone's telling me they can't hear me. Can people hear me?
Hi, Natalie. We'll work behind the scene if you wish.
Okay.
Yeah, but fine. So you can go ahead with your presentation. We're going to contact
I'll
them
keep
and
going.
figure out what's going on.
So cover crops for soil conservation. So cover crops are not new. Back in 1936, they were saying cover crops are good because they can prevent excessive erosion of soil. That's why we call them cover crops. They can prevent leaching. That's why in Europe they call them catch crops, and they can aid the liberation of mineral plant food, or some people call them green manures. But back then they also recognized that there are disadvantages of cover crops, primarily the cost of seed, the cost of labor, and the uncertainty of getting a stand and possible adverse effects. So, since 1936, there have been some changes. I think some especially big changes are that brassica cover crops have really taken off in a big way. And there are some other new cover crops. I'll talk a little bit about phacelia. And I think that we're sort of at this like cover crop revolution. I think it's sort of a rebirth of interest in cover crops. And so there's a lot of interest from farmers, and I think that as researchers and as ag professionals, we need to stay in touch with what farmers want out of cover crops, but then we also need to stay in touch with what the research is actually saying about cover crops. So SARE, North Central SARE, put together this cover crop survey. There were over 1,900 farmer respondents. Fewer than 50 were from Maryland, but I want to talk a little bit about it so people can kind of think of how farmers are approaching cover crops. So the factors that influence cover crop adoption. Number one, the perception that cover crops are costly is the number one reason that somewhat limits adoption or always limits adoption. So those can be costly. Cover crops are costly in terms of seeds, labor, and equipment. The perception that cover crops make planting more difficult. It can lead to wet soil. There can be residue on the surface. It can require different equipment than you might be used to. The perception that cover crops are difficult to terminate. It requires an extra step to kill cover crops in an already narrow planting window. And then finally, the perception that cover crops reduce yields in the following cash crop. This can be through nutrient immobilization or delayed growth. I also want to add that there's an opportunity cost of cover crops, and there's sometimes farmers have a difficult time finding the availability of the cover crop planting window. So if those are the things that are limiting cover crop adoption, what would those limitations look like with winter-killed cover crops? So you'd get rid of the problem of terminating cover crops, which was the third most common problem. You could eliminate the problem that cover crops make planting more difficult if you chose low residue cover crops that wouldn't interfere with the planting equipment. And if you had cover crops that actually provided some nutrients to the following crop, then the perception that cover crops reduce yields, I think, would be limited. Now, the perception that cover crops are costly is kind of the tricky one. So what I think we need to ask is the value of the agroecosystem services greater than the cost of cover cropping and the foregone revenue? So then, what are the agroecosystem services that farmers are looking for? So the desired benefits from cover crops. This is as a percentage of respondents. The number one thing is farmers want cover crops to increase soil organic matter. Almost 74% of farmers want cover crops to increase soil organic matter. The second thing, farmers want cover crops to reduce soil erosion. Third thing, farmers want cover crops to reduce soil compaction. I think this is one, having worked with forage radish a lot, that we've noticed is really significant, and I think has come up in the last 10 years, that this is a possibility that cover crops can actually serve this really important function and replace kind of mechanical processes by alleviating compaction biologically. So this is really important for farmers, ranks in the top 3. Controlling weeds is the fourth thing. And then after that, providing a nitrogen source and other benefits or agroecosystem services. Now, it's interesting to me that farmers cited all these problems with terminating cover crops, difficulty planting, and yet having a winter-killed cover crop is very low on the list of desired benefits. So what we have to ask is, how do we reconcile what farmers want, which is all of these things: organic matter, reduced erosion, reduced compaction, weed control, with what they don't want, which is interfering with the cash crops, costing a lot of money, etc. And then finally, how do we reconcile that with what we all want for the environment, which is reduced nutrient loading, etc. So I want to clarify a little bit what I'm talking about when I say winter-killed cover crops. So there are non-winter hardy cover crops. When I say winter-killed, I'm talking about forage radish and some other brassicas, phacelia, and oats. These are cover crops that die when the temperatures reach the teens. They're not cover crops that die when it frosts. And I have this picture up here. This is from the winter of, I think, 2011-12, when nothing really winter killed in Maryland. And so I know that, it's kind of borderline sometimes whether things actually winter kill, but I'm still going to call them winter killed cover crops because most of the time they do winter kill. Frost-killed cover crops are crops like buckwheat, sun hemp, and sudex. These are more summer cover crops, so they do winter kill, but they don't take advantage of that fall growing season after it may have frosted, but before it gets really cold. I also just want to say that there's no reason why you can't mix winter-killed, frost-killed, and winter-hardy cover crops. So I'm going to talk a little more about forage radish, some about phacelia, mostly because these are the two cover crops that I consider sort of low residue winter-killed cover crops. And then I will talk a little bit about oats as well, which is kind of the traditional winter-killed cover crop. Okay, so going back to the top 5 desired benefits from cover crops, this is as ranked by farmers, and comparing that to the services that forage radish as a cover crop can perform. So number 1, add organic matter. So this graph here is from some research that Ray and some of his previous grad students did over, I don't know, this is like 8 site years or something, on biomass accumulation of cover crops. And what I want you to see here is that radish can accumulate a lot of biomass. It can add a lot of organic matter to soil, but early seeding is really critical. So as you go out in weeks past that late August seeding date, the biomass accumulation dramatically declines. So we have people ask us a lot, can I plant radish in October and get much of a benefit? And the answer is really no. It's not going to provide a lot of biomass. The second thing that farmers want from cover crops is to reduce erosion. So this graph here is the erosion measured from 3 February and March rainstorms where there was no cover crop and where there was a radish cover crop. And you can see the difference is substantial. Now this is kind of the worst case scenario of a no cover crop. This was a fall tilled field. There were some weeds. This was not a no-till field where there may have been some residue. And so the contrast here may be more striking than it would be in a lot of situations. And radish may not prevent erosion as well as some high residue cover crops, but nonetheless, the difference between a radish cover crop and a tilled field is substantial. Now, one of the reasons why radish is still pretty good at preventing soil erosion, despite being a low residue cover crop, is that in that early winter period after it's winter killed, it leaves this mat on the soil surface that looks kind of like this, and it isn't until March or April that this mat really starts to disappear and leave the soil bare. So the third desired cover crop is to reduce soil compaction. Now this is the benefit that where I think forage radish and other brassica, tap-rooted brassica cover crops really excel. So this picture is a canola root. It's not actually a brassica root, or it's not actually a forage radish root, but it's canola performs very similarly to forage radish in this way. And so I'm going to click and see if I can get this little pointer here to work. Yeah, so this is the canola root. This was taken with a mini Rhizotron camera in May. And then come July, the soybean root had used the exact same root channel. And so by creating these pathways, the subsequent crop can take advantage. Now, do the subsequent crops take advantage of this compaction alleviation? Yes. So this is some data from Guihua Chen, and it shows that going down to 60 centimeters, both corn and soybean roots have higher root densities following a forage radish cover crop than they do following no cover crop or a rye cover crop. So forage radish really does open up those pores and allow the subsequent crop to get deeper, which gives the subsequent crop more access to water and nutrients. The fourth was to control weeds. Again, this is something where radish really excels, but it's really important to get that early seeding date for weed control of radish. So here we have the planting date weeks after August 20th, and when you plant on August 20th and 1 week or 2 weeks after, you get pretty much complete weed suppression. There's no data there because there were no weeds. But as you go further out, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, you start to get weeds in March. So if you want that complete weed suppression in early spring, you have to get a late August cover crop seeding. And then finally, the fifth reason was to provide an end source for the subsequent crop. And I sort of combined that with the sixth reason, which was to be a nitrogen scavenger. And this is something, again, at which radish really excels. So how deep does radish go and how much nitrogen? This is a picture from a field day we had back in, I guess it was 2013 now, and I'm sure some of you were there. You may even be in that picture. And we did a little experiment to see how much nitrate was just hanging out deep in the soil profile. And it's not that I didn't trust your augering and your measuring, but oh good, someone says, hey, that's me, great. So I went back on December 3rd and I dug some more holes and I measured it myself, and just to get some consistency. And what I found was that where there was no cover crop planted, there was this large bulge in nitrate N at about 60 centimeters. And if you look throughout that soil profile, there was 165 kilograms of nitrate nitrogen hanging out in that soil profile where there was no cover crop. Where there was a radish cover crop, there was much less, you can see, and below 60 centimeters there was almost zero. So radish does a really good job of mopping up the soil profile of any residual nitrate. I did this in Maine as well. I actually live in Maine now, so I'm up here and there's 4 feet of snow. But so I did this in Maine in 2013 as well, and I found there was about 40 kilograms of nitrate nitrogen in the soil profile. And this is a much less heavily manured soil. It's much sandier. I wasn't expecting as much nitrate nitrogen, but there was still a substantial amount in the soil profile. So again, just more data, similar. Probably lots of you have seen this graph already, but this shows that a radish cover crop may actually clean up multiple years of fertilizer. So what Jill, Dean, and Ray suspected was that these little bursts here were the 2 past fertilizer applications, or 2 past years worth of fertilizer applications, and where there was forage radish and oilseed cover crops, they cleaned that right up. Some of this research had sort of inspired Ray to seek another grant looking at this concept of deep nitrogen and using cover crops to mop up the soil profile. And so they are currently working on a project. And I don't think there's any information out there yet, but they're engaging a lot of farmers, and I think it'll be really interesting. So keep your eyes out for information on that project. Okay, so mopping up the nutrients. This is my schematic. So all the little dots are various nutrients. And so with this deep-rooted cover crop, forage radish cover crop, it brings them up to the surface. But then what happens when it dies? and those leaves aren't supposed to be green. They're brown in my version. But the thing is, with forage radish, any of you who have experienced it, it's not like all of a sudden it dies. You think it dies, but then it goes back to life, and then it kind of dies again, and then it comes back to life. And so there's this very complicated dying process of forage radish. There's a lot of freeze-thaw cycles. Whoopsie. And when it finally does die, you're left with this big taproot hole and these, possibility for preferential flow pathways. So what happens to the nutrients during winter and early spring? And I looked at this question of when is nitrogen mineralized in spring, and these are some data from Clarksville, which is that same soil where there was just a ton of nitrogen hanging out in the soil profile. And you can see that, oh, this isn't Julian Day, sorry, but you can see that in April, there's just a huge burst in nitrate nitrogen following radish, which is the red, compared to oat, which is the green and no cover. Oat basically doesn't provide any fertilizer credit. So it is winter killed, but and it captures a lot of nitrogen, but it doesn't make that nitrogen available very quickly. Same thing the following year, similar pattern, just happened later, and if you all recall, it was a colder spring, and so I think that just has to do with the biological activity and how fast that nitrogen was getting mineralized. That's air temperature on the bottom there, cumulative degree days. So how much nitrogen are we talking about? Well, that difference there is 33 kilograms per hectare nitrate nitrogen. Similar there, it's about 34 kilograms per hectare. But where was I going with that? Oh yeah, but so you might say 30 kilograms per hectare. Well, that's a lot, but if you look at the data for how much nitrogen the cover crop took up, it was like 150 or 200 kilograms per hectare. So where's all the nitrogen going? Y was a similar story, less overall total nitrogen, but again, forage radish, which is the red, had significantly more nitrate than no cover crop or oat. Phacelia, how does phacelia stack up? Since I mentioned it, and some of you who were at the field day in 2013 saw phacelia, and unfortunately we weren't able to get any data on the spring mineralization from phacelia, but we did get data on the nitrogen capture, and much to my dismay, because I really love phacelia, it did not capture as much nitrogen as radish. That doesn't mean it's not a good cover crop. It just means that radish is exceptionally good at scavenging nitrogen. Phacelia was still impressive in capturing over, close to 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. Unfortunately, one of the benefits of phacelia that folks in Europe are really excited about is its flowers and using it as an insectary. But if you don't plant it until September in Maryland, you won't get it to flower. So that's really more of if you use it as a spring crop. So kind of in summary of forage radish, since I was talking about the benefits versus the pros and the cons. Forage radish doesn't require termination, but you do need an earlier fall planting date. It has a lot of other benefits that farmers are really interested in, like biodrilling and weed suppression, but again, you need an earlier fall planting date. It doesn't interfere with spring planting, but it may not protect against erosion quite as well as high residue cover crops. It mineralizes nutrients for early cash crops, but you may lose nutrients through early leaching losses or denitrification. And since you all are nutrient management professionals, I thought I would linger on this concept a little bit. So the nutrient loss potential. This is my artistic sort of rendering of the situation you have after forage radish dies. You've got all these little forage radish carcasses on the surface. You've got these large taproot holes, and then the root holes that could be preferential flow pathways. So again, going back to the Clarksville data, we've got this big difference in nitrate nitrogen after radish, but it doesn't even come close to the amount, even when you combine it with the amount of plant uptake. In this case, we're growing spinach. It doesn't come close to the amount of nitrogen that was in the cover crop tissue. You don't expect 100% mineralization from cover crop tissue, but still, there are some questions about where the nitrogen might be going. One question I've had is if there's actually a substantial amount of tissue nitrate when the cover crops die. And I looked at the tissue nitrate in cover crops when I harvested the biomass samples, and I found that nitrate nitrogen actually accounted for up to 25 or 30% of the total nitrogen in the cover crop tissue when I harvested it. Now that wasn't at the time of winter kill, so it could have changed by the time the cover crops die, but nonetheless there's a substantial amount of nitrate nitrogen in these cover crop tissues that could go somewhere when the cover crops die. There are freeze-thaw cycles, especially in Maryland. Where I am up in Maine, it's pretty frozen for several months of the year. I'm not super concerned about a thaw until April, but I know where you are, it freezes, it thaws, it freezes, it thaws, it rains, it snows, and so there's a lot of freeze-thaw cycles. There's also water-soluble phosphorus in this cover crop tissue. And as I mentioned, there's the potential for preferential flow. So I wanted to do a quick poll while I've got everybody, and I'm wondering how I do the poll. I think Nastya is in charge of that. Great. So this is just a question, and you will not be judged by your answer, but did you attend the phosphorus symposium? Yes, no, or yes, but I wasn't paying attention. And I believe these answers are anonymous, so you don't have to worry about Trish knowing your answer. Just gonna wait a minute, okay. All right, so we've got 50% yes, 48% no, and 1 yes, but I wasn't paying attention. Thank you for your honesty. I'm gonna end the poll. Okay, and then I guess okay. So the reason I ask is because I did not attend the pea symposium, but I did hear that there was some mention of cover crops and this possibility that cover crops might actually add to phosphorus losses. And that kind of perked my ears up because I'd been reading about this possibility as well, but it forced me to dig a little bit deeper into the literature to see what has actually been done and what the evidence shows. So, do cover crops increase pea losses? So, you all know phosphorus loss is not all from erosion and runoff, as was the long ago held belief. There's definitely the possibility for loss from leaching. but there are very few studies on cover crops and phosphorus loss. And most of those studies are greenhouse studies. They're not field studies. And so it's hard to draw conclusions from them about what would actually happen in a field situation. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. So this is a recent one in Plant and Soil, if anybody wants to look it up. It was a lab study where they just took the cover crop tissue, which they had grown in a greenhouse setting, and they exposed it to different weather scenarios, different freeze-thaw cycles, and then extractions with water. What they found was that when there was no freezing at all, just the fresh tissue, and the legend there, I've spelled it out for you, is white radish, white mustard, oilseed radish, and phacelia. They saw that white mustard did actually have some initial losses. These were 5 consecutive extractions, I guess. But then when they exposed the tissue to continuous freeze-thaw cycles, they saw, and you have to note the different axes here. The B only goes up to 0.1, whereas C goes up to 4. They found that there were, in those first extractions, huge amounts of phosphorus coming out of the cover crop tissue. So, but this was a lab study. This was not in the field. Same researchers did a field experiment where cover crops were grown in the field, and then the soil cores were extracted and exposed to freeze-thaw cycles and precipitation in the lab. They found that the phosphorus loading after these freeze-thaw cycles went in the order: oilseed radish was equal to perennial ryegrass. White radish, which is what we would call forage radish, was a little bit less, and white mustard was actually the lowest. Now, these results are somewhat contradictory to what they were finding in the lab results when they just exposed the plain cover crop tissue to the freeze-thaw cycles. So both of those studies, I think they're interesting because they show, okay, cover crop tissue has a lot of phosphorus and it can come out with water, but neither one is particularly convincing to me as far as what's actually happening in the field. I think they're suggestive. Charlie White, who was a student who's now at Penn State, did a study looking at the phosphorus concentration around radish root holes, and he did some calculations. On the right there you can see he calculated that there can be as many as 80 radish taproot holes per square meter in the field when you seed at a recommended seeding rate, and the phosphorus concentrates the radish concentrates the nutrients around its taproot, and so you get what some people would probably call kind of dangerously high levels of phosphorus right around the hole, and then depleted levels in the rest of the field. So this means that it may increase phosphorus losses if there's water carrying that phosphorus down the radish hole, but it may also act as kind of a banded fertilizer. He didn't measure leaching losses or runoff losses at all, so we don't know, but radish definitely does sort of reconfigure the phosphorus concentrations in the field. So the conclusions, I guess, for phosphorus loss in cover crop tissue can have a lot of phosphorus. Freeze-thaw cycles, oops, I was supposed to say may, increase phosphorus extraction from tissue. Radish definitely does increase phosphorus concentration around root holes, but other field data are really lacking on losses. And so I think some of these data are suggestive, but let's not jump to conclusions too quickly. Phacelia may have lower phosphorus losses, and it does not provide those same taproot holes, and so it may be something to consider in areas where you are concerned about P losses. All right, I know nitrogen and phosphorus are the nutrients of most concern, but I did also want to mention, just sort of beyond NPK, these are some sulfur deficient plants, and one of the things that I looked at was the soil sulfate after forage radish cover crops and oats. And what I found, this is the data from all 4 site years, was that forage radish consistently increases soil sulfate early in the season. So I know especially in no-till situations that surface soil sulfur can leach down, and there can be initial sulfur deficiencies. But when you've grown a radish cover crop, the sulfate is concentrated at the soil surface. So these increases amount to 8 to 12 kilograms of sulfate sulfur from radish. So when do winter-killed cover crops make sense? When you can minimize nutrient losses, so in other words, before early spring crops and or deep-rooted crops, when you can capitalize on early weed suppression, again, before early spring crops, and when you have a late August planting window to get that radish cover crop in. And I say radish, but it's also phacelia and oats. All of these winter-killed cover crops, if you want the biomass contribution and all the other benefits, you really have to get them in before the beginning of September. So there are a lot of farming systems where you don't have a late August planting window. I know one of the things that people are working on is aerial seeding into standing cover crops to try to move that planting date up. Another system where there is a late August planting window is a lot of vegetable systems where you're growing multiple crops and you've got some crops that are coming out in August, and you do have a window there. Now the issue there is that there's also an opportunity cost of planting that cover crop, because you could grow another cash crop during that period as well. It also makes sense to use winter-killed cover crops when you're mixing them with another cover crop. So say you want the benefits of bio-drilling, but you're not going to seed an early spring crop, so you can mix forage radish with a winter hardy cover crop. So the project that I worked on primarily was trying to capitalize on that niche for forage radish by using it for early spring vegetables, no-till early spring vegetables. And this was a Northeast SARE project, and I do have a website that there's a lot more information on it than I'll talk about today, and that's notillveggies.org. So if you want more information on this project, definitely check out that website, and also feel free to email me. But so a brief overview of that project. One thing I didn't mention about forage radish is the difference in spring soil moisture. And instead of throwing another graph up there, I've basically just decided always to use this photo, which is from Julie Fine at UMass, because it illustrates the point so perfectly that in spring after forage radish, soil is trafficable, it's workable, and where you don't have a cover crop, you end up much more often with something like the soil on the left there, where if you drove on it, you'd probably cause a lot of damage. So spinach was the primary crop that we looked at in this system, and we do have a publication that's available again on the website that I gave you. You can download a PDF of that. But we found that in some contexts, as no-till seeding of spinach after forage radish does work, and in pretty much all contexts, well, on all contexts that we looked at, forage radish definitely increases the yield of spinach. The question is just whether you can actually no-till seed it or whether you need tillage to get good production. So we found that at Clarksville, which is that high organic matter, high nitrogen soil, there was actually no difference in either site yield or between the tilled and the no-till after the forage radish cover crop. Actually, there was a difference. In 2013, the no-till was actually statistically higher than the tilled. So no disadvantage to skipping the tillage in that setting, and big advantage to having a forage radish cover crop. At Y, very different soil, kind of a soil that maybe is a little bit addicted to tillage, and we found that radish does increase the spinach yield, but no-till plantings did not yield as well as tilled plantings. So again, I guess the take-home there is that radish across the board increased spinach yields. Tillage was sometimes necessary and sometimes not. We did look at other vegetable crops a little bit, not in depth, and we found that there was some delay in maturity, possibly because of soil temperature. There were no negative effects of no-till seeding on emergence of the crops. There was just an effect on the maturity of the crops. So here we've got some romaine lettuce and some kohlrabi. Now, I did this in Maine, where people said, that's stupid. You know, why are you trying no-till in Maine? And I also did it with carrots, which is, I think, again, people would say, well, that's not a good idea because they're a root crop. They're going to be really affected by the no-till seeding. But it's a very sandy soil, kind of a perfect carrot soil. And I actually found that there was no delay in maturity, even in our cold climate. And there was actually a higher percentage of marketable carrots in the no-till plots than there was in the tilled plots. There was slightly lower emergence, which affected the yields, but the quality was higher in the no-till carrots. Some other crops that people have looked at, peas, and Gordon Johnson at the University of Delaware has been looking at pea production, and he's also found that peas work really well after forage radish. They really benefit from the compaction alleviation because they're very sensitive to soil compaction. Just another picture of some peas. So I guess to conclude a little bit, I heard somebody say once, there's no silver bullet, there's just silver buckshot. And I appreciated that because I think that we often do look for the silver bullets, and we have to recognize that it's going to take multiple approaches, balancing the pros and the cons of each situation. So for farmer adoption, cover crops have to have multiple agroecosystem services. They can't just do one thing. Like environmentally, we think about leaching and we think about erosion, but farmers are thinking about a lot more than that. And so to sell the cover crops, they have to do a lot more. One thing I thought was interesting from the SARE survey, and I know it's really small in this picture, was that of the respondents, and this is I think almost 1,500 respondents, the vast majority had never received any government assistance for planting cover crops. And I think in Maryland, it's a unique state where there's been so much government support of cover crops, which is fantastic. But ultimately, cover cropping sort of should be able to pay for itself. I guess I shouldn't say things like that because that's kind of a political statement. But there are farmers across the country who are adopting cover cropping because they found that it pays in their system. Winter-killed cover crops can fill some important niches. I think they're underused and underappreciated, but we do need to know more about the nutrient loss potential. And I think one thing that is kind of the way of the future to address some of the problems with monoculture cover crops is to look into cover crop mixes. And I know a lot of people are doing that. So I have no idea if everybody's asleep right now or still with me, but I have time for questions. So go ahead, and I guess, I don't know if we just do them in the chat or if people can actually put the audio on or what.
It would be best if people just wrote their questions in the chat box to the lower left-hand corner of their screen. Right, sorry,
Okay,
lower
I'm
right-hand
waiting
corner of their
for
screen.
questions. Type faster. While people are typing away, maybe I'll go into some other. Oh, I've got some. Is P loss the biggest issue then? I think nitrogen loss is also a pretty big issue because that mineralization is happening so early. I think if you have a sandy soil and you don't get a crop in by April, you're going to lose a lot of that. So I think it's P and N loss. I think that there is still some potential for erosion losses too, because by March, April, it's a pretty bare soil. Please explain the N loss. Doesn't the cover crop fix nitrogen? No, the cover crop is not fixing nitrogen in the way that a legume would fix nitrogen. It's capturing nitrogen. It's storing that nitrogen in its biomass. But there are two potential routes for more than that for nitrogen loss, primarily in the form of nitrate. So either as the tissue dies and there's nitrate actually in the tissue, you can lose that nitrate via leaching or denitrification, or as the tissue is decomposed and you've got nitrogen mineralization, you can also get nitrate and lose it via those same pathways. So if early planting is not an option, is it worth planting forage radish late with another cover crop? Or should I just choose another cover crop? Yeah, that's a good question. And some people have actually been looking at planting forage radish at a really low rate, like a pound per acre, I think, maybe 2 pounds. I think it's just a pound with wheat, because there have been farmers who have reported yield increases. And my hypothesis on that is that that's a sulfur effect. And so I think if you are interested in, for example, the specific sulfur effect, then it's worth planting it with another cover crop, especially if it's a small grain. It might increase your small grain production. But if you're looking for the bio drilling, then it's really not worth planting it. Okay. Is anyone looking at P losses in cover crops? Studies now beginning. Yeah, Well, I know these folks in Scandinavia are looking at it. That's some of the data that I shared, but again, it's a lot of lab stuff and simulations, and I think that one of the big differences between Scandinavia and Maryland is that they experience, in some parts, sort of harder winters, deeper freezes, and they also, almost across the board, use spring tillage. And so one of the issues that people are worried about here is these preferential flow pathways, especially in no-till settings. So I don't know if that answers your question, but as far as I know, there's not enough research into it. All right, any other questions? I think that while people are writing, I think that the research on the phosphorus loss from cover crop tissue coming out of Scandinavia is interesting because it's not just these brassicas. Like I said, there was high losses from annual ryegrass. So I think there are a lot of questions there. All right, it doesn't look.
I can.
No, that's okay.